So today we have about $220 million of endowment, which really enables us to pay the rent, operate successfully, and to use capital to recycle it into preservation projects.
Hi, I'm Geddy Shreikauskas, and this is the Hudson Valley HV1 Podcast. And we have as my guest today an old friend, Peter Bienstock, who I think we have in common an interest in history.
Oh, yes.
In the history of the Hudson Valley in particular.
Absolutely. And the history of our lives in the Hudson Valley. Mm-hmm. But my involvement here goes back to when I was 5 years old, which is 76 years ago, when I came here in summers, and our family stayed at a farm in Wallkill, which took boarders, and I helped milk cows. Probably just got in the way. But anyway, I got to know stone houses and old Dutch barns, which were fascinating to me. Nothing like New York City, where I was brought up and lived. And got interested through all that and into my teenage years, particularly in the Dutch period here, mm-hmm. and the early settlement period. And I've been involved in projects ever since that are associated with all that.
Yeah, the stone houses give us sort of a sense of rootedness. They connect to the landscape and to the economy and to the culture and everything.
And a remarkable number of them have survived. They were well built, and the Dutch could build anywhere they wanted. So they built in places that were relatively high and dry, and that were accessible to what were not necessarily then roads, but they were trails. They'd been Indian trails, and then they became what were called corduroy roads, where they would put logs down. And in fact, those were great places to put houses, and the basic material, the stone, was very cheap, but it was heavy labor. But if you were pulling up rocks anyway, that were thrown up every year by the frost, why not use them to build walls and then houses? And so they have lasted, and they are really the most unique thing about certainly Ulster County, but also the whole Mid-Hudson region in terms of residential architecture. And the great Dutch barns, of which very few survive, were just extraordinary. And they were there's a great scene in the movie, I think it's Witness, the erection of a Dutch barn, of an Amish barn in that Harrison Ford movie. And it's to thrilling music. I don't know, it's one of the epic scenes that I've ever enjoyed in the movies, where the Amish have made all the pieces, and they're all numbered. And as the music plays, the walls go up and the roof goes on, and it all happens between breakfast and right after lunch. Right. Fantastic. And our barn, my former wife and I had a barn, and I later settled on a farm in the western part of Shongam, near Brunswick Corners, and we had the oldest dated Dutch barn in America, and it was every piece was numbered, and they had clearly erected it the same way. In a day, they made it all on the ground, and then they put it up in a day, and all the neighbors came, and I'm sure it was a barn raising just like the Amish actually still do in Pennsylvania.
Mm. Now, the Dutch barns were distinctly different from the English barns. The shape, the H barn.
Right. Well, the Dutch barns there were no silos. They were on the level. The Pennsylvania Dutch barn, which were of course not Dutch, they were Deutsch, they were German, Palatine German largely, were on a hillside so that you could come in a ramp on one side, and then the animals were below that in a much warmer place, dug in under the ramp, which insulated well. So you had the animals below, but you could ride directly into the hayloft. The Dutch barns were basically on a square plan, and the animals were downstairs, and there was usually a loft, not a full second story, which was where you'd throw the hay. And in those days, you're talking the 1600s, 1700s, there were no bales. You just tossed the hay into the upper loft, and then you threw it down as the animals needed.
Oh.
But beautiful, absolutely beautiful, and all wood. And by the time we got there in the 1970s, the original 1720 siding was paper thin. I mean, it was like onion paper, and we had to handle it very delicately because and in some places it had been replaced, but it had actually lasted for 200 and some years.
Yeah, it's interesting how Kingston is probably, I don't know, it's maybe the largest single collection of stone houses. I don't know, Hurley, New Paltz.
Hurley too.
Yeah.
But what's fascinating about Kingston is it's an urban community, so that most of the Dutch houses are out in the countryside and they're farmhouses. But Kingston, like Huguenot, the Stockade,
Right.
like Huguenot Street, and Hurley, these are actually villages where people might have done some farming, but their main income would be from making clothing or making secondary products from primary crops, caning chairs, and lately a lot of antique dealers. But they adapted that style of building to an urban situation, and so you actually had these stone houses sort of cheek to jowl next to each other. It's very different, but it's fascinating.
Yeah.
Beautiful, absolutely beautiful building.
Yeah, and I like the street pattern reflects that one of my favorite places is Vauxhall Avenue, which leads to Vauxhall, where one of the founders, an Englishman, Thomas Chambers, I believe, lived. They've never found the actual Vauxhall, but they know that Vauxhall Avenue goes from there down to the river.
Thomas Chambers. There was a great Hudson Valley early painter named not the same Thomas Chambers. Do you know?
A redheaded guy.
Could have been.
Yeah.
Could have been. It's probably Scottish.
Yeah.
But I was brought up in Manhattan, and I kept looking as I grew into my teens and 20s for remnants of what I saw in the Hudson Valley, and there is nothing. There are a couple of houses which were preserved, the Beekman House, a couple of houses in Brooklyn, which are stone.
Yep.
But in New York City, everything old was destroyed and replaced. So you can't find Dutch New York, but you do find it in the street names. Maiden Lane, Canal Street, Broome Street, which are English, English as well as Dutch.
There are maps of where the stockade was at a certain point in the old, where it moved. And it's fascinating. But you also are interested not just in that, but we were talking about your involvement in the D&H Canal Society, which is, I guess, in its peak in the mid-19th century.
Yes. I'm involved in a project to restore the old, what was the Dupuy Canal House restaurant building, the old Dupuy Tavern on the canal in High Falls. And that's a great stone building. In the 1970s, there was a wooden addition added to it by John Novy, who had his fabulous restaurant there. And the Delaware and Hudson Canal Historical Society, which I'm president of now, acquired that building and is restoring it and creating a museum of the canal. And the canal started in, I guess it was the 1820s, was at the time the largest funded industrial project in America. And it was founded by the Wirtz brothers, Quakers from Scranton, Pennsylvania area, who had big coal holdings. And they were trying to figure out how to get this coal to New York City, which was growing rapidly and desperately needed fuel, but it also needed timber and other things.
And who would have thought that the answer was to build a canal from Honesdale, Pennsylvania to Kingston to round out New York?
Bizarre, but if you look, or let's say you drive west on Route 84 or on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, it's like this. You are crossing mountain after mountain after mountain. So taking that coal in an era when it was horse-drawn carriages to New York City from Scranton meant crossing mountain after mountain after mountain range. The engineering cost was gigantic. And what they figured out was that if they headed it east, and brought it to Kingston, it would be much, much cheaper, not only to build but to operate. And then you could barge the coal, particularly, but other things, down to New York City. And it ended up, of course, they not only barged coal, but they barged timber, a lot of timber. And then more locally from this area, bluestone, which went to New York and was a major paving material for the streets of New York City. So they built, with the help of John Roebling, who went on, the Roebling family went on, as you know, became great bridge builders and built the Brooklyn Bridge. But with help from the Roeblings, they built bridges and created this 106-mile-long canal, mainly using Irish immigrant labor. And it was largely Irish immigrants who built not only that canal, but the Delaware and Raritan Canal in New Jersey, worked a great deal on the Erie Canal. And so there was a tremendous supply of cheap immigrant labor. And a lot of women were involved in operating the canal boats, and African Americans, freemen, who were paid a lower wage than everyone else doing labor on it who was white, Caucasian. So we had even wage differentials in those days that were discriminated against women and African Americans. But it was a remarkable feat of engineering, the canal, and it really made it possible for New York. Today, coal is considered a climate change disaster, but coal was crucial. Without it, good coal, New York City, good in the sense of efficient burning coal, New York City could have never had the phenomenal growth it had in the 19th century.
Well, physically, the canal, how wide was it? How many locks did it have where you have to change in elevation? Tell us a bit about
well,
that.
And here I get, I'm sorry that our ace curator, Bill Merchant, is not here to add his words. He's very good on these details. But the width was about 11 or 12 feet in most places. It was very narrow. The canal boats were very narrow. And the number of locks, I think there were 30 or 40, but I can't give you an exact number. Mm-hmm. That's where I defer to others on the details.
Is there are there locks near the canal house?
There is a lock literally in front of the canal house that's one of the best preserved. Mm-hmm. And there are remnants of locks going all the way up through Ellenville and Würzboro, which was, of course, named after the Würz brothers, and right up to Honesdale. The entire length of the canal is a National Historic Landmark. And that actually, there's a committee that of which our curator, Bill Merchant, is a key member, and there are some scholars of architecture on it too, who are studying what's left, what's needed to be done to protect and preserve it, and doing, in effect, a refreshing and redesignating of the National Historic Landmark designation.
How does a lock work? What does a lock do? It's the boat comes to a certain place, they fill it with water, and it changes elevation.
Yes, and that means you have to have reservoirs periodically along the line of the canal, so that you can raise the water.
Yep.
After all, you're dropping a considerable amount of height from, and you have to, because that's to get flow, from the Appalachian Mountains in Honesdale, which is essentially Scranton, Pennsylvania, down to the Hudson. And so as you drop, if it just ran straight down, the boats would be out of control at high speed and all end up crashing into trees. So what you have to do is raise the water and drop the water to accommodate the movement of the boats. And it's complex engineering. And what actually happened late in the 19th century is the owners of the canal decided that they would build a railroad parallel. And then because railroads came in and got popular within 20 years after the canal was first dug, and so they decided that was a very efficient way to carry the coal,
right.
But it followed the same pathway in effect.
Yeah, so that the canal era was very hard to do. The canals were hard to do, and when the railroad came along, it replaced them. So here we are at industrial Kingston, the Rondout, and Wilbur in particular, and Island Dock, where the coal was, I guess, dropped at some point, and then zillions of tugboats all over the place,
Yes.
steamers, etc. It was a whole way of life that the remnants are fascinating.
Well, it all ended right around the turn of the century. By about 1900, the traffic on the canal really had collapsed.
Yep.
And it was, in effect, all that freight was going on the railroad, which
Yep.
was owned by the same people. Towards the end, one of the interesting things is that Rosendale cement was discovered,
Yes.
which was a phenomenally successful form of cement. It cured very slowly, which is why it finally went out of style. But because Portland cement came along, which could harden up very quickly. But Rosendale cement was phenomenally long-lasting and effective. And so by the second half of the 19th century, cement became a large form of traffic on the canal and then subsequently on the railroad. And it's interesting that the part of, and now we get back to the Roeblings, who now were using Rosendale cement to build the Brooklyn Bridge
Right.
at the end of the 19th century. And the only part of the Brooklyn Bridge which has not really needed any maintenance since it was built is the Rosendale cement part, which is below the water line.
Mm-hmm.
It's so, and the other wonderful, there are still photographs of the old Manhattan storage warehouse on, I think it was 3rd Avenue and 80-something Street in Manhattan, which was all grouted with Rosendale cement. And when they wanted to tear that down to put up some apartment houses or something in Manhattan in the 1950s, it was almost impossible to demolish. And there's some photographs that we have of they knocked out the windows, they knocked out the wooden parts, and then there's a skeleton of a building, which is all Rosendale cement. And that part, I think they finally had to use explosives to.
So folks, you can kind of intuit from this conversation that this man is interested in history. We spent time as at Marist College had a publication twice a year of regional history, and that we used to meet and talk about that. Now, it's hard to imagine that a person with such an interest in preservation is also a developer.
Well, yes.
So let me ask you about that. Do you see it as in a way a conflict or kind of a deepening of knowledge to combine those two things?
Well, first of all, I should say the development business was very good to me, and it enabled me to do a lot of nonprofit work for the last 10 years. That's all I've done is nonprofit work. And over the preceding 30 plus years, I always spent about half my time on nonprofit work because I was able to make enough as a developer to fund my hobbies and my love. But the development work I did on the whole was, to me, consistent with my principles in terms of historic preservation, respecting land, acting in a way that's consistent with environmental sensitivities. We basically, we developed in 7 or 8 states, and what we would do is create communities where houses were clustered for the most part, sharing water and sewer. And then there were large amounts of open space which were shared by the homeowners and administered by them. Once you had a certain number of homes sold, there would be a community board which would take over the maintenance of the common land, which was covenanted so it couldn't be developed. People could ride horses, take hikes, have gardens, community gardens. So in general, what we tried to do, and I say we because I had some partners, is to provide attractive housing which lived with the land.
What are a couple of local examples of your development around here?
Well, off Springtown Road in New Paltz, one of the early developments I did was a large property. It was about 600 acres, and it had 3 or 4 farmhouses on it and barns, which we. So, I'm getting a call. That's terrible. I have to turn this off. So what we did was created relatively large lot properties around those and sold them to people as second homes where they could have a little farm area of their own. And then we created large lots. Most of them were 10 to 20 acres off a road we built. And you can drive up that road today and you won't see any houses. You'll see forests and then a long driveway in. And most of those houses have taken advantage of the woodlands that were there and let them grow up. And people have built nice houses in there, and it's a nice community.
Now, you told me you served on a planning board at some point.
Well, I have been very active as a board member of Open Space Institute. So if development is evil, I atoned simultaneously by doing that. And that board I've been on for about 40 years, and it of course has done phenomenal work to protect, particularly in southeastern Ulster, but all up and down the Hudson River corridor, to preserve iconic open spaces, but also to create access to them. For example, the new Minnewaska. All those Minnewaska parklands came to the state through Open Space Institute,
right.
And it funded, raised the money for, and did the planning for the new Minnewaska Park Visitor Center. And we also created the River to Ridge Trail and a number of trails. And we're working very hard on trail systems, mainly on the west side of the Hudson, but actually on both sides. So that is another activity I've appeared before many planning boards. I've never sat on the other side of the table.
I'm sorry about that. I thought otherwise.
I'm not sorry. Look, you can only do one thing at a time.
OSI has an important reputation as kind of when something becomes available, serving as sort of a go-between or a temporary owner, and then transferring it to state.
Yes.
State when that's appropriate.
Yes, and what that's enabled OSI. OSI looks hard. We started in New York when I first joined the board 40 years ago, and now we're the largest entity in Georgia and South Carolina.
Yeah, I see.
In northern Florida.
It looks like
it's amazing.
States.
We're doing phenomenal work in Pennsylvania, so we generally can do that kind of thing because we work with the local, state, environmental departments in New York, the DEC and the Parks Department, and we look at their long-term plans. They all have long-term plans for their wish lists of the lands they would like to own, to administer, to add to their forever wildlands, say in the Catskills and the Adirondacks, or to their parklands for the state parks organization entities. So when a property comes up, which might connect two key pieces that the state has, and it wants that piece, whether it's in New York or Georgia or South Carolina, it often takes the state a year or two to get together the money to do the appraisals. It's a very long, complex, awkward process. And meanwhile, a developer may buy it and get approval and build 50 houses. Right. So what OSI can do is say, okay, and it's on a handshake. We don't enter into a contract because that would be circumventing the law. But we trust the states 90% of the time they come through. Right. And so we will go and buy that land and hold it for the period while those procedures take place. And then we will sell it to the state essentially for what we paid for, plus our overhead costs of maintaining it. And that is a kind of rescue program because so often these things come on the market and the same things that make them attractive as beautiful open spaces make them attractive as developable spaces.
Yep.
And so, but what doing it that way means is we have our money back in 2 or 3 years, and now we can go do it again.
Right.
So the key to the way and now I'm wearing my conservationist hat rather than my developer's hat, my OSI hat, but what we can do is then recycle that money over and over and over into protection of more land.
How much capital does OSI have? It must be enormous.
We were very fortunate. We in Scenic Hudson were the beneficiaries of large trusts set up by the Wallace family who created the Reader's Digest, which people our age know all about. It was hugely profitable, and the Wallaces were a childless couple who owned the whole thing themselves, left all their money in a series of charitable trusts. And they had trusts for the Hudson Valley, which were meant to buy land in the Hudson Valley. And at some point in the 1990s, the state got into litigation and said these funds should be given to local organizations rather than just the income being paid out every year for projects. Give the money to local organizations that are doing this. So half of it went to OSI and half went to Scenic Hudson, which gave us at that time about $100 million each, a little over $100 million each of Reader's Digest stock. and then we've reinvested it. And today, plus we've gotten contributions to our endowment from individuals and foundations. So today we have about $220 million of endowment, which really enables us to pay the rent, operate successfully, and to use capital to recycle it into preservation projects.
So it's an important social role that a former developer is appropriate for.
Well, I think part of the reason I know that back 40 years ago, I had sold Open Space Institute 2 very large, beautiful pieces of land, which I had intended to develop. And after the deals closed, I said to Bob Anderberg, who was then general counsel and still is, and we've become very close friends, I said, you overpaid. You really overpay for land. And it's a waste of money. And a few weeks later, he came back and said, how would you like to join the board and show us how to buy land? And that had a fascinating ending. I set about talking to staff about how they bought land. And what I realized was that they loved buying land. They loved protecting land. And to tell them, if you can't walk out of the room because the seller refuses to accept your bid, you must be able to walk away. And what they ended up saying is, we need to pay more because we have to get the land. The developer can go buy a different piece.
Sure.
But the piece we want is important in the public interest. Mm-hmm. And if you teach us how to leave the room and not buy because we didn't save the last dollar, we're undermining our own mission. And I realized they will inevitably overpay by a little bit in most cases, but that doesn't matter. When the publicity comes out that they have saved this iconic piece, and it's in the front page of the New York Times and Hudson Valley won, they'll raise plenty of money. People will say, great, we love that, here's my check. And so in the long run, they will perform their mission, save the iconic and crucial pieces of land, pay a little more, but make it back from a grateful public.
Mm-hmm. Now the examples, excuse me, the examples of land have changed. That when I was younger, they bought the Centennial acquisition to the Catskill Forest Preserve. It was several thousand acres that stretched from Woodland Valley to opposite the visitor center in Hinchy Visitor Center, and now they're interested in the Onteora Lake area, mm-hmm. where the somebody who wants to develop an industrial plant has a piece of it right in the middle of connecting pieces of forest preserve, and there seems to be a war going on to try to wrest that away from that fellow who managed to lose every case that he gets involved in.
Well, I have to admit now that the details of specific activities of OSI have grown so enormously mm-hmm. that I don't keep really close touch with specific deals anymore. We are now, as I say, we went from being a corridor within the original Wallace mandate for us was you can spend your money within 30 miles of either side, or I think it was 30 miles of either side of the Hudson River, period. Yep. To now we're in huge activities in Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama. And meanwhile, we have ramped up our work in the Adirondacks. And so I know a little bit about most of those things, but I have to admit, what you're talking about is something I will go home and read more about, because I'm sure there's a memorandum.
Bluestone Wildfires.
Oh, the Bluestone Wildfires. Yeah. Oh, you didn't mention that name. That I did follow a little more. Yeah. And I think that's still in litigation.
Yeah, it's an interesting case. And it's as not as determined, but clearly there are some valuable parcels of which this would be a key acquisition. Yeah. And somebody wants to develop it for industrial use. It's a classic example.
Oh yeah. No, I remember reading some material on that and thinking, this is really going to be decided by the courts, because there are significant environmental issues about the use and the impact on what are already protected lands, and that's there. There's plenty of law on that issue.
Well, this has been fascinating for me. I love the idea of somebody so steeped in the history of the area and the ecological pattern of its evolution is doing the Lord's work in different ways as time goes on. So thank you very much, Peter.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the chance to talk about my various joys in life.
And it was easy, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah. Like falling off a log.
Thank you. Thank you.